Good morning. This is Joy Hull Bryant with DIR. We're so glad that you could join us today. Today's program is part of the Technology Today series, which is hosted by the Texas Department of Information Resources. Our topic is SharePoint for Record Management, and we're lucky enough to have our DataPoint Solutions friends to share their expertise. Let me go ahead and turn this over to Ed Cherrick with DataPoint, and he will start us off. Ed?
Thank you very much, Joy. Thanks everyone for joining today. We look forward to continuing this series. We're actually going to have another webinar in a couple weeks regarding migrating data into SharePoint. So today we're going to have a web demo regarding SharePoint for records management. And Jason Dawsey, who is our Director of Professional Services, will actually be performing the webinar. I just wanted to briefly, for those of you who haven't attended one that we've already established, I wanted to present to you a little bit about DataPoint and who we are. We are a dedicated division for SharePoint consulting from the company DataBank. Some of you might know of DataBank. They're an industry leader in document conversion and management services, do a lot of department-level solutions, essentially scanning, migration of documents. So they are a national company. We are part of that concern, and we specialize strictly in SharePoint. And as you can see, we've got some significant accomplishments that we've tried to leverage within the SharePoint space, that being that we are a Microsoft Gold partner and a critical SharePoint partner as well. And those are things that we certainly work closely with Microsoft about, and we think that this represents a significant step in how we can prepare a SharePoint environment that works best for you. We, as you can see, specialize in discovery, deployment, implementation, training, and support of Microsoft for business automation. And this goes for not just the IT professional, but for end users and for business owners as well. We want to make sure that there are governance plans in place, anything we can help with to make sure that the SharePoint environment is used and used efficiently within the organization. Once again, our expertise runs across a myriad of topics, which includes like workflow, internet planning, whether it be for a public-facing website. We do integrations and implementations, and any kind of governance and compliance. We'll work with you with your SharePoint environment. One of the things we're very proud of is the partners we have, and some of them have been used in previous demos, and I'm not sure which ones we could even touch on today, but we do have a very great relationship with some third-party companies that will enhance the SharePoint experience for things like workflow, digital signatures, infrastructure management, viewing, and searching within SharePoint. And lastly, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware we are a DIR contract holder. That includes some software solutions as well as our professional services. And hopefully we saw a few of you at the DIR Connect last week, where we did attend. And if we did talk there, nice meeting you, and I hope to continue the discussion further. Without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Jason Dawsey, and Jason will be able to talk about the records management scenario. If you do have questions, please feel free to ask them in the questions box on the right side. We'll answer them either at the end, or if they're particularly relevant to what Jason is talking about, we'll answer them at that point. Any other things Jason might ask, or I might interject with one of the polls, so don't be surprised if we ask for hands once in a while. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to share those too in the question box there. So without further ado, Jason.
Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks, Ed, for the great introduction. So today we're going to start to talk about records management and how we can do that very efficiently within SharePoint. One of the things Ed said was we concentrate a lot on different areas, as you can see on my screen here. which gives us a whole lot of ability when we start looking at records management, because it touches so many different areas and so many different places within your business and within your content areas. So the first thing when we were talking about what are records, you would think they are the old vinyl records, but they are not. Today what we're talking about is actually records, which are items constituting some kind of evidence in the past, be it maybe physical records or even electronic records. So the physical obviously being something you can hold, you can touch, something you can walk in the hallway, and electronic records being what you actually have on your desktops and your computers or on your file shares or in your SharePoint environment or another ECM RM solution. And it's important to identify the difference between electronic and physical records, because at that point is when you try to figure out what you're going to do with each record and how you're going to capture each one. And we're going to go into a lot of that throughout this webinar and this demonstration as well today. So what kind of type of records are we going to be talking about? One obviously is going to be your enterprise records, which are constituted by your day-to-day records. And it can be something around litigation, it can be a personnel or employee records, or records about sales, contracts, legal purchases, things that you need to keep around for your enterprise. And it might not necessarily be maybe an industry standard or compliance area for outside your organization, but for your enterprise, you want to keep those close and make sure that they're managed correctly. The next one's going to be industry records, which these ones are going to be where a lot of your other compliance areas like HIPAA or NARA or any of DoD standard. And these ones are going to be specific to industry. So if it's a pharmaceutical industry or if it's a government entity, these industry records are going to be a little bit different than your enterprise records, because it's going to be really dependent on who's going to have access to it, how they're going to be managed, and what's going to happen throughout the life cycle of that record. And last but not least is the legal hold records. Now these are just a few of the records, but these are the ones that we're going to talk about today. So your legal hold records are going to be ones that are mandated usually by counsel or a compliance IA officer to be held outside of this position, meaning anything can't happen to them because they're on hold for some reason. And I'll show you how SharePoint can manage those throughout today as well. So records management, the standard 15498 :2001 defines records management as a field of management responsible for the efficient and systematic control of the creation of the record. And this includes disposition as well as capturing and making sure that it's efficiently managed and also found in a general efficient manner. So where does records management sit in SharePoint, and where does SharePoint sit in records management in terms of where most people rate it? So this is actually by Gartner from 2003 September, and this is actually looking at all the enterprise content management systems out there, which records management and information management kind of falls under. And as you can see, Microsoft and IBM sit at the top of the leaders as well as the visionaries of making sure that the ECM space is where it needs to be. So that's where SharePoint sits. But now, for those that don't know what SharePoint is or haven't used records management in SharePoint, I want to go over some key terms, some things we're going to talk about to make sure that we're on a firm understanding and have firm footing as I'm talking, making sure that I'm not going over anybody's head with the lingo that I'm using, or making sure that we have a general understanding of these individual terms. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are sites. So in SharePoint, SharePoint creates websites, essentially just like you would go to Bing.com or Microsoft.com. The difference is that SharePoint makes the sites that are internal to your organization, typically not exposed to the internet or not exposed to anybody that's outside your organization. And that's important because where sites are in SharePoint land, you can have individual sites for departments or working groups or industry specialists. So think of it as having maybe an HR site. Now, an HR site can be for the use of anything for human resources, which have maybe employee records, leave requests, resumes, 1099 forms, your whole 9 yards that HR deals with. But then you can also have an IT site, which is a little different, where they might be storing maybe schematics or CAD drawings. Now, even though they're both in SharePoint, they're separated by the term sites, which some people may be able to go to the HR site, some people may be going to the IT site. No, they are separate. And that's important because when you're separating your records and when you start to identify what your records are in SharePoint, it needs to be identified from the top level, meaning it needs to have a holistic view of your whole environment. So being able to identify what records can be created in the IT site or will be created in your HR site. So it's important, and it's an important term that we'll talk about throughout the day that I want to make sure we're on front boarding on. The next thing is a file plan. Now, typical records management and RM professionals will look at file plans and say, okay, well, we need to identify the records. We need to know what happens to the records if something happens, or if litigation happens, or how long do we need to keep it? What happens if we don't keep it? And that's one of the first steps that we typically use when we look at doing records management in SharePoint, is doing the actual file plan, looking at making sure that we have the content in the right places and doing the right things with it. The next thing we have are going to be content types, which you're pretty much used to the content types as you are now. You may not know directly what the content types are that you're dealing with, but a content type in SharePoint land is essentially a document type. So when you think of an HR document, you might think of those, invoicing or maybe an employee record. That is essentially a content type. So document types equal content types. Now, the reason why they're special and why they're important in SharePoint is because at the content type level is where we do it and identify what we're going to do with maybe retention, disposition, metadata, as well as indexing. So metadata in SharePoint, which is my next term, is data about data. And this is important, for example, if I'm trying to capture what's PII, which is personal identifiable information, or PHI, personal health identification. Each one of these guys are going to can be held in metadata, which then can be searched or discovered within SharePoint, which actually brings us to the next term, is auditing. So when we do have these individual things where you have maybe a PHI or a PII document or any other type of compliance area that you're trying to audit, we'll be able to see who opened it, what happened to it, who edited it, where it's at, how long it's been there, what stage of the cycle it's in, from nuts to bolts from an auditing perspective. The next term we have is disposition. So what happens after X amount of time? Do we delete it? Do we move it? Is there a workflow, which in SharePoint electronic workflows will allow us to automate certain processes? And at what schedule? So do we keep this document for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and then what happens to it after, which a record schedule is going to be another thing that we talk a lot about. Now, search within SharePoint and search within any other product, it's similar. So search basically will search just like if you go to bing.com and search your name, maybe make sure that your resume is up to date on your searching. Your search within SharePoint is the same. It captures your metadata, maybe information inside the document, but also in record sense, your search also runs basically your litigation. So when you do e-discovery, how do you search? What terms do you search for? Is it the metadata, is it the content type, or is it something in the document that you're looking for? And this is all ran by search in SharePoint. E-discovery within SharePoint is very vast, and I'm going to show you a lot of cool features and some things that might help your industry or your organization. And last but not least, the other term that I want to touch on is the record lifecycle. Your record lifecycle may be a little different than what I'll show today, and each company or organization has different compliance areas that they need to look at, which may have a different record lifecycle. But today what we're going to really look at is taking active documents, so maybe a digital document from a client computer or a file share or an email system, or maybe a physical document, maybe a document that you have to fill out yourself and then have a physical document. But then actually pushing it into a application, which we're going to look at SharePoint. And basically what we're going to look at is the capture of the metadata, the capture of what the document is, looking at the retention policies, how long do we have to keep it, what happens to it, if we have to put it on hold for any litigation, destroying it, as well as making some choices, some things that we don't necessarily know about yet. Some records at the time of disposition, we have to make a decision from a records management standpoint to figure out what we need to do with it. And that's really what we're going to be talking about throughout the whole presentation today. So the first thing that we would necessarily do when we look at records management is look at all the elements that we have. So the first thing we need to look at is a content analysis, basically looking at the categories that we have in an enterprise, figure out what we're going to do with it. Create a file plan, so looking at, okay, what happens, this is how long I need to keep it, this is what happens if I don't keep it, who needs to look at it, who needs to see it, how often do they need to see it. And that really kind of goes down to the compliance requirements. So if you're trying to comply with HIPAA requirements or SOX compliant or NAR compliant or any of those record management portions in SharePoint, we have to basically account for those requirements in SharePoint. And some of them SharePoint doesn't handle natively. Sometimes, there's a lot of third-party programs out there that, Ed and I had talked about a little bit that, bolster the capabilities that SharePoint has to ensure that it complies with those different areas. One natively is the DoD 5015.2 compliance. For anybody that's on the call that's familiar with that, SharePoint natively is not that compliant for that directive. So there are tools out there, and they're becoming more and more relevant that you can make SharePoint into those extreme RM systems that comply with all those different areas. But then we need methods. We need to be a method how to collect, we need a method to audit, and we need a method to capture. So how all those things kind of come together throughout the day, we'll show you. As well as a process for holding. How long do we hold it for? Is it a litigation? Is it a legal hold? Something like that. And also from the reporting side, how do we monitor and report on those to maybe your lawyers or your legal counsel? So today what I did, just to kind of give you a little ramp up, so this is basically identification of what I put together for today. So, and this is your typical HR system. So we have insurance plans, pension plans, payroll timesheets, invoicing, questionnaire, training videos, shipping, press releases, emergency contacts, and this is basically where you start. So I look at the kind of records that may be put into or in my organization. I'll group them up into categories. Now these categories are essentially those maybe sites that we were talking about. Maybe we have an employee benefit site, a payroll site, and really what that depends on is who can access each one. So a site in SharePoint has permissions that you can actually say, okay, I want maybe 3 users to access the employee benefit descriptions and 3 employees to access payroll. And this will basically create a logic separation between the different areas that you may want to work with. And then also a description. This is always a good plan to kind of work with. Now from here, we need to create a file plan. And essentially, to streamline this conversation, I've already created one. So from now, I'm going to go actually into SharePoint now. So we're going to leave the PowerPoint and go start looking at some technology. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of here. Now within SharePoint, what we have is the ability to actually look at a file plan and see what happens. So I identified X amount of records. So there's a whole bunch of different records here. We have 401ks, we have insurance plans, we have pension plans, and we did a description on them. What kind of media they're coming from? Are they web pages? Are they print? Are they electronic documents? Where are they coming from? What category they sit in? Now these are the categories that I identified initially when I was looking at my records. We're looking at my whole enterprise, seeing all the different things that I have. Then I looked at retention. So how long do I need to keep this? Now this can be driven by, once again, as I said earlier, industry records, maybe something that's individually to your industry. Enterprise, something that's in your company only and only your company does. Or something from a legal standpoint. So I came up with 3 to 6 to 1 to 2 to 4 to 6 years. Now each one of these will be a little different depending on what it is and what that compliance area, the records compliance I'm trying to do, as well as the disposition. So after that 3 years, what happens to it? As you can see here, my 401ks, my pension plans, and my insurance plans have none. So as I mentioned earlier, some plans or some records, we don't know what to do with them until they come to that point. And we'll show you some disposition pieces here that we can do with workflow, so that digital workflow, that automated process that we can do. As you can see here, I have some that are actually destroy, so get rid of them altogether. Some have archive, and the rest are a mix of both. And we also have a contact. Who is the owner of these? And it's very important who the owner is because, for example, if my insurance plan comes up to this position, who should I contact to make a decision on what happens to this record at that point? It's always a good idea to put a contact on your records management for the responsibility and role delineation of what you should be doing and what you actually should contact in case of an emergency or in case of litigation. So what we're going to look at first is, and we talked about it a little earlier, content types and metadata. Now this is a prime example of what identification in records management is. So we need to identify what the document is, because before we identify it, it may be something that's out there we had no idea about. Be it a 401k, I don't know if it's a 401k within SharePoint unless I tag it or if I identify that it's a 401k. So I'm going to show you how to do that within a SharePoint library. Now, SharePoint libraries are essentially document storage within the SharePoint environment. And what this does is it'll store content types which hold metadata, so data about data, and it'll present it in a manner that I'm hoping a lot of you have seen in the past, being that you're working in SharePoint. And if you haven't, if this is the first time you're seeing SharePoint in a document library, welcome. This is one of the better systems that are out there. As you can see here, I have some Excel type columns here. I have one that's called name, one that's called content type, one called effective date, and so on and so forth. Each one of these columns, which are very similar to an Excel sheet, are what we call metadata, so that data about data. And these data about data are very important because, as you can see here, my content type that we talked about earlier, I can see that this is an insurance plan. I can see this is a payroll timesheet. I can see this is a resume. And I can see the owner of those documents. Now, from a record standpoint, maybe the people that can access this document library may be slim to none, but the right people have access that can identify the records as well as make decisions upon what happens to them at any given point in time. So at this time that we're capturing data, so how do we get documents from wherever they're located at into this document library to be managed and to be looked at as a record or a system of record? So there's two ways you can do that, obviously, because it's dependent on what the record that you have. So let's say we have an electronic record. How do we get an electronic record from maybe, say, my desktop or my file share or my email into SharePoint? Well, that is easy because we're starting out with on our electronic document. So, for example, let's say I have a file, and I can let's call it a resume, for example. Now, what I can do is I can go to my ribbon bar, which I'm sure you're used to seeing within your Word and your Excels and your Outlooks, and I can just hit Upload Document. Now, at this point, this will let me browse out to my file shares or my desktop to find the document that I'm looking for to put into SharePoint. Or I can essentially just drag and drop it right onto my screen. Either one works, really depending on what you want to do and what you're comfortable with doing will work. So, for example, if I'm going to go ahead and do it in the manual way, so if I go to my Files tab and I hit Upload, which I'm going to take it from my desktop and put it into this environment. So if I hit Upload, this will give me a familiar screen where I can say browse out to my desktop. I can give versioning, which is very important when you're doing records, because you want to make sure that all the versions are captured at any given time. So if I hit Browse and I go out to my desktop, I'm going to scroll down, find the document that I have, and I have a resume here. I can just hit Open, which will automatically populate the location of where it's at. I can hit OK, and this is where the magic happens. This is where the identification comes. This is the screen that I tell the system what this is. So this is an identification where this relies very heavily on the user. So the person that's putting in here has to generally know if this is a resume or a timesheet or the different content types that I'm looking at. Now, the important thing here, and the one thing I want to touch on, is systems and third-party companies are getting very smart with what they're doing here. So there are companies out there that can actually look in this document, find key terms, and automatically classify this document for you without the need of the X factor, which is the human factor of classification. Now, that is the ideal method. So having an automated system look at this document, classify it for you, and once again takes this manual identification out of the process. SharePoint natively has some capabilities of doing that, but the capabilities of automating that identification is going to be mainly with your users without a third-party tool. So, for example, I know this is a resume because I put it together. I can go down and say, hey, this is a resume. Now, this will automatically change the metadata that I have to it. So each individual content type that I have can hold different metadata, and that's where those key terms came out earlier. So the document type or content type in SharePoint can hold many different types of content or metadata. So, for example, my resume may want to hold the owner of the resume, who the resume is about. But if I was looking at maybe an insurance plan, it might be who the care provider is. Is it Care First? Is it an HMO? That type of work. So depending on what content type I have, changes the data that I want to collect about it. And that's important because when it comes down to the classification maybe, or something else that we're identifying the record with, we need to know those different terms, that metadata collection, that capture, that identification before so. Being that this is a resume, I can say, this is Pete Smith's resume for 2014. Now, a lot of people that are using SharePoint will say, well, why do I have to put a title if I have a name? Well, your name may be identify to you really well. So this might make sense to me, but when you're looking at SharePoint, which is a collaborative environment, you want to make sure the title or something that you can put in there as a description that's relevant for everybody. So, not something that something that everybody should know. This is very common even with practices with file shares and net shares that are out there, where you may know your folder structure very well, but if somebody else comes in there to try to look for a file, they will get lost in your flurry of folders, and you have no idea where things are. And this is really where the power of SharePoint comes in, not just from a records management, but from an enterprise content management system. Being able to classify these metadata values or these index values to make sure it's efficiently found by not only you, but for other people as well. Now, my classification, this is where metadata becomes really powerful, because now classification to some people may mean one thing, classification to another person may mean something else. But in my system, I'm looking for classifications for if it contains PII or if it doesn't contain PII. Now, being that this is just a plain text box, this doesn't tell the user anything. This doesn't tell me what I should do with it. But on the back end of this is what's called managed metadata. So it's a managed data about data. And what that means is I basically set out and I put in some key terms into this managed metadata field that I want the users to pick. Now, they might know, so they might start typing contains, and it will give suggestions. Does it contain PII or contain PII? And what this does is it streamlines your process, meaning that if, for example, if I try to put in banana, it's not going to let me because that's not a term that I'm looking for. It's not something that I'm looking for. It's not going to mean anything. Banana doesn't mean anything to a resume. So basically what I did here was, and if a new user comes in, they're like, oh, I really don't know what's here, they can always hit looking for valid choices, which shows me I can pick contains PHI, contains PII, contains PHI, or does not contain PHI, or PII. Being this is a resume, may contain PII, but it might not contain PHI. Once again, PII is personal identifiable information, and PHI is personal health identification. So, for example, I can go ahead and put that in there, and then I can maybe type out the other one, does not contain, and those both are the terms that I need. Now, these come in very, very relevant when we start doing e-discovery. So keep this in mind. Remember this when I'm doing this, as well as an effective date. Now, we can always use a created date, but the effective dates are nice in SharePoint, because what I can do is I can say, yeah, I might be just getting around to putting it in SharePoint now, being it's the 5th of June today, but really this document was effective last year. So then I can change the date, which will allow me to help for this position. Now this is Pete's resume, so I can go in here and just type in Pete's name, and I can say, oh, cool, Pete's in there. Save it. Now what I've done here is I've just started the whole records management lifecycle. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to show you here, is what happens to these documents. So being that this is a resume, what happens to a resume? This is a payroll document, what happens to the payroll? And this goes back to my file plan. So looking back at my file plan here, I have maybe my payroll records, which after 6 years I need to destroy it. I have my resumes here, which after 6 years I need to destroy it. I have some insurance plans that have 3 years, which I don't know what to do with yet. So how do we manage these things? What point and what different things that we have do we look at? So if I go into my library, so the place that I'm storing these documents, I can create a file plan digitally. Yes, that's pretty cool. I'm hoping you're excited as I am, because file plans in SharePoint are fantastic and helps us identify and work with documents. So inside SharePoint, I'm going to go behind the scenes and look at my settings here. And looking at my information management policies, this is where the file plan comes to life. So I look at my information management policies, which essentially tells me what I should be doing with these documents. So you can see here, those content types that I was talking about earlier, I can define retention schedules and different things for IMPs, or information management technology, to each one. So I can say I want resumes to be one way, payrolls to be different, insurance plans to be different, because each one of these holds different client areas and holds different retention schedules and disposition schedules. So for example, my insurance plan, if you remember correctly, I don't know what to do with insurance plans. So let's go ahead and take a look at insurance plans and what's going to happen and different things that I can do with insurance plans. So the first thing I can do is I can give it an administrational description, meaning I can give a description for our managers, our RM people, to really say what we're doing with this. And this would be typically what we identified in our file plan. also a policy statement, so basically allowing me to have any kind of description of special handling or anything that the users need to be aware of. Now this is where the magic happens. So now we have a retention schedule. SharePoint can handle not only a retention schedule from a single retention schedule, but we can have a multi-stage retention, as well as a recurring schedule, meaning after one thing happens, I can actually start another thing. And this is very special. For example, if I click on my retention stage, so I have an effective date, which is the data we're collecting from the metadata, plus 3 years, I'm moving it through the recycle bin. But that's not really what we're doing because we don't know what we need to do. So let's say if I click on this and I hit edit. Now what we have here is I can say whatever date that I want, I have declared record, modified, or created by. These are the dates that I'm collecting, plus X amount of years, days, months, whatever I want to put in here. And then I have an action. So I have an action to move it to the recycle bin. So this is basically just deleting it, but it's going into the recycle bin if I ever need it again for 30 days at least. Permanently delete, so this is destroying the record. Transferring it to another location, so if I want to move this to maybe a record center or a discovery center, as well as starting a workflow, which we're about to do. Skip to a next stage if we had a multi-stage retention, being able maybe to, after 3 years, maybe declare it as a record and then go to another stage, or delete drafts and versions. Once again, remember how I said earlier where versions and drafts are very important in records management because we need to know the whole life cycle of that document to properly identify what that document is, and as well as come with litigation. Let me give you an example. Let's say we have a policy, and it's an employee evaluation policy. And this year, you have to give your employees a 1-year evaluation every year, have to have it. But throughout that year, it changed from 1 year to 6 months. So the policy then changes. Now, at that point, we need to identify that that record or that policy has changed. And we need to make sure that we're looking at what it changed from. So in case if maybe a discrepancy comes up, but it happened before that policy changed, we need to be able to look back and say, yes, at this time, this was the policy. But now it's a different policy. So it's, once again, version is very, very important. Now for this one, let's say we don't know what needs to happen, obviously, to this. So I already created a workflow before this called insurance plans disposition. Now what the workflow does, it gives the user or the owner, so remember how I said that those owners are important? The owner has a choice to do something with this document. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK here, and I can see that after this date, it's going to basically start the workflow. Pretty cool, huh? I love this. This makes life so much easier for records management and really adds a lot of value to your RM inside SharePoint. The next thing that we're going to talk about is auditing. Once again, we can do individual auditing based on the content type. So you can see here I actually enabled auditing, and I'm looking at if anybody opens, downloads, views, or views the properties of the documents. I'm also looking at if the document's been edited, or checked out, or checked in. Now, being that we maybe locked down these permissions, or I'm not really aware about moving or copying items, I'm not auditing these two things, only because I don't have the right permissions to be able to do that anyways. The next two are going to be barcoding. So barcoding will allow me to prompt a barcode before saving or printing documents that are made inside Word or inside Excel. And what this does is it puts a barcode on top. That way, if you ever try to scan this back in, the barcode can be read via the common barcode like 3 of 9 or another barcode that's out there. As well as labels. So if you want to put a label on maybe these insurance plans to be confidential or contains PII, I can essentially create a label for it. That way, when it's printed out, it's basically like a watermark. So that way, you have insurance that if this is ever printed, it's going to contain that label so they can't distribute it to maybe your workers or distribute it in a physical manner without that barcode being on it. And you can also use contextual variables. As you can see here, you can actually put the project manager. So in most cases, maybe your label might include contains PII and may put the owner of that document in there. That way they can be notified that, hey, your document was printed out and it all contains PII, but it's printed and distributed. Once again, these can be done based on content type. And once again, those content types are very special because maybe your insurance plan might be a little different than your payroll or your resumes. For example, if I go to my resumes, I can see that my effective date plus 6 years equals permanently delete. Meaning it doesn't go to the recycle bin, it's deleted out of my system and deleted out of my databases. So going back to my library here, Now, obviously, if we had all the time in the world, I would wait 4 years with you guys, and we can start a campfire and grill s'mores. However, we don't have that much time. So what I did want to show you today is basically how to do that disposition without waiting that disposition time. So, for example, those insurance plans, I'm going to go ahead and start that disposition workflow on it manually, meaning I'm not going to wait till the end. I'm going to do it now. So what I'm going to do is actually click on this and say, create my disposition. Now what this is going to do is going to go and assign the owner a task, which is me, and then I can choose to either move it to the record center, delete it, or extend this another year, meaning I don't look at this record again for another year. So it might be maybe legal reasons, or I just don't know what to do with it yet, or it hasn't came out yet. So if I go ahead and hit start, this will start that process off. Now, normally, in most records management situations, this would wait the 5 years or the 6 years and then kick that workflow off automatically, meaning it requires no use and no action to you. So the workflow automatically sends me an email saying that I have a task, meaning that I have to pick something. So if I click here and say respond to this task, I can come in and see, I can say delete record, move to record, or extend another year. If I delete it, obviously it gets deleted. If I move it to a record center, this takes basically this item from this site and moves it somewhere else, which we're going to get to in just a second. Hold on to your boots. Or I can extend it in another year. I'm going to just go ahead and say I have no idea what to do with it. And say OK. And what this will do is this will extend that document out another year. That way it doesn't get looked at again for another year. Now, let's start talking about record management and how they differ from the different areas that you can do inside SharePoint. So the first thing you can do, you can generate a record where it's located at. And what I mean by that is it's called in-place records, meaning that I don't move this document. Where it sits at, it becomes a record. As you can see my payroll document here, if I hover over this, there's a little lock icon here, right? And what this means is it's actually locked down. So if I try to look at this document, I can't delete it, I can't edit it, I can't do anything but view it. I can view the version history and I can view compliance details. But essentially what this happens is this document is locked down in its place, meaning it doesn't have to move. So when your users go back to view this later on, they don't have to go to a different place. So it's where it is located. The other side of the world is I can transfer this document somewhere else. So as you can see my insurance plan here, there's a little icon that says it's out somewhere else, which means I transferred this somewhere else, which I transferred to what's called a record center. Now, a record center is a separate site. So remember how I said earlier, sites delineate permissions. And really what that comes down to is who manages these records. If it's in-place records, your site administration might be the records management. Now, if that person is the certified RM person, meaning they have the knowledge and they have the experience to manage records, they can keep in place. But that's not always the case. Some people that are SharePoint masters aren't records masters. Some people that are records masters aren't SharePoint masters. So how do we delineate who does what? In-place records and record centers are the way to do it. So for example, if it's in place, meaning that I lock it down and I make this a record where it's sitting at, that means the site administrators are the records managers, meaning they're the ones that are going to be ultimately responsible for the record. The documents I transfer to the record center may be different permissions, meaning there might be different people managing those records. So if I go to my record center, which I have a link on the top of my screen, and hit records management, I can go to my insurance plans, which is the record center, totally separate permissions, totally separate everything. I go to my insurance plans and see my documents there, and it's already locked down. Meaning at this place right here, where this sits at, this is the record center. Meaning if I become a litigation or if I have something that my counsel wants to see, I don't have to give them rights or access to my all my HR records or all my IT records or all of my purchase orders. I can just give them access to my record center. It's a single place that they're looking at those documents, and it's a lot faster to find. Let's be honest. Most legal proceedings, they charge by the hour. You want to be able to get them in, find what they need, and get them out as quick as possible. Record centers provide that one-stop shop for your legal counsel or litigation. Whereas in-place records provides a great deal of capability, because now I don't have to go around looking for this document. I know where it's at. But from a legal proceeding standpoint, that might be a little bit difficult. Now, it's very easy to do. I can say, for example, if I want to maybe move this document somewhere else, I can just quickly go up to my tab here and say declare a record, which declares this record in place. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. It says, are you sure you want to declare this a record? I can say yes. And basically that is now a record. Now I cannot delete that, I can't move it, I can't do anything to it besides view its capabilities. The other important part of that is, as you notice there, I declared that record manually. Well, that's a big red flag. You shouldn't be able to declare records manually. That is true. But for the time period that we have, I wasn't waiting the 4 years to make that declare record manual or through the system. Systematically, this will be declared a record after my retention period happens. So remember I said earlier where there's retention periods where after 5 years it's deleted, or it's 5 years and it's declared a record. Those schedules are based off these effective dates, and it will happen automatically. It means that, once again, no interaction from the user, no interaction from you. Once again, that cuts out that X factor, that human factor of being able to identify that I need to lock this down as a record now. But in the terms of demonstration, I wanted to show you. Same thing with moving this to a different location. So if I want to transfer a file, maybe this insurance plan, to somewhere else. So for example, if I want to move this to my record center, I can go to my File tab and say Send to Record Center. And then essentially what it'll say, are you sure you want to do this? And I say, yeah, that's great. It tells me the new link is where it's at. And then when I go back over to my insurance, as you can see, the little icon says it's moved now. So really, this is just a link to the other site. So when I come over here, there's my generic logo. That's my insurance plan. Now, so there's some magic happening in the background I'm going to show you. I'm going to kind of pull back the curtains a little bit. How did SharePoint know to put this into my insurance plans library in my record center? How did it know? Anybody want to take a guess? If you guess it's metadata and content types, you are 100% right. So what on the back end of this is what's called the content organizer. And what the content organizer does is based upon roles that we set, will automatically determine what that record is and where it goes. So essentially what I can look at here is I can give it a name, I can give it a priority, meaning some are low, some are high. I can give that content type that name. Also I can look at many different things. I can look at property-based situations. For example, let's say I wanted to anything that's a PowerPoint document. I can say if the name ends with .ppt, means this will look at the file and say, hey, this document ends with PPT. It must be a PowerPoint. And I can tell it where to go. And this is important. Once again, it automates that feature. It automates that disposition. It automates where it goes. And this is also very important when it comes down to litigation, those legal counsels. You may have record centers and libraries for insurance plans, resumes, policies, and you might not want to give all library access to everybody. You might only want to give them access to what they're litigating or what they're providing counsel for. So this will automatically move that to the right place. As you can see, I already have an insurance plan one. So if I look at this, I can say, just take a look. I can see, oh, look, if it has a name insurance plan, that's where it's going. And it's moving to this site. So just making sure that I'm pulling back the curtains, making sure there's no funny business behind these curtains. This is all happening real time within the system automatically. So on the other side of this, so I already moved this over to the record center. I've already made this a record, but what does that really mean? It means I can't delete it, but what does that mean? So let's actually look what that actually means. So the first thing I want to look at is the compliance. So when you mark something a record, obviously you can't delete it, you can't do anything to it, but it opens up the board for a lot of things. First thing is I can see the retention. I can see it's 6 years, permanent delete, no reoccurrence, and it's scheduled to happen 6/4/2020. Once again, I'm not waiting that long. It's a lot of s'mores and a lot of fire that we have to burn. But we're going to look at some things automatically. So the first thing is I can see when it's declared a record. I can generate an audit log report, which once again, this is looking at if it's been opened, if it's been edited, if it's been moved around or deleted. Or, for example, if I want to put this on hold, now this is important as well. I can put individual records on hold. So for example, a litigation hold. Maybe this document is coming up to its deletion portion, and it's like, oh no, we're going to hurry up and delete this. And we don't need to delete because it's going to be something important. I can actually hit add, pick the hold, so I can say this is on litigation hold, and save it. Now what this did was basically just save that document from getting deleted. So now it's on hold, that way when it does come 2020, which once again, we're not waiting that long, it's on hold. And when it's on hold, I can do a lot of cool things. One is I can do discovery on. I can say what's all on hold. So back to that, paying the council for per hour. I'm going to show you great ways to actually look at that, making it very quick and easy to do in just a second. The other portion that we can do from a records management, making sure that we're good to go, is copies. So policies, training manuals, all those things are very important. But what happens to them when we need to make sure that this training policy goes to multiple sites? So maybe this has to be on your IT site or your training site, but you want to manage that locally, meaning you want to have one copy of the truth, meaning that all the other copies or all the other documents aren't the truth. This is the one copy of truth. Well, that's a common issue because once you pass these out, they can be passed again, changed, passed again, changed, passed again, changed. How do we manage that from a record standpoint? And the way we do that in SharePoint are using copies. So just like we can move this document to a record center, we can also make copies of this document. So for example, my governance training document here, I can click on it and I can say, manage copies. And what I can do here is I can make a new copy. Now what happens when I make a new copy is going to ask me, where do I want to put this copy at? I can go ahead and know my URL already, so I'm kind of cheating. But I'm going to send it to my training site. So this is a separate site. Once again, different users, different metadata. Hit OK. Now I have two copies. So just to make sure that you know that there's nothing going on behind the curtain, I'm going to go to my training site. I'm going to go to my training manuals, and you can see that it's there. Good stuff, right? Now, let's say if I update this document. Let's say, oh, I need to make an update on this. Like, I change a word, or I change a very critical portion of this. I can update copies. Pick what copies I want to update, and hit OK. It'll say, are you sure? It'll basically move everything over. And if I go back to my training manuals, as you can see, it's not there right now. There it is. So essentially, you manage all your copies from one central location. Imagine the possibilities. Imagine policies, having that one location for policies, and it could be on separate sites, separate places, and you just hit update, and it updates all of them for you. Think of how much time and effort that will save everybody. That's fantastic. Exciting, and it's good to have. So we talked about copies, we talked about records, we talked about record centers, we talked about how to manage in-place records. Now we're going to talk about e-discovery. So now we have this environment, we have all these records, we have disposition going on. What happens? And why is it important? So in SharePoint, we have what's called e-discoveries. Now, e-discovery is broken down to cases, almost like case management. So if I go to my cases, you'll see that I actually have one. I have a case called contains PHI. Now, what this will show me is I can actually look at my whole environment as a whole and look at all the different things that are going on in here. So for example, if I want to see all the documents that are on hold with PHI identified in it, if I look on here, I can see that my discovery set's at, I have a filter saying anything that contains PHI. Now remember, earlier on I said that metadata, that's important metadata that we wanted to capture, that contains PHI, contains PII. This is why. Because now I can look at this and say, anything that contains PHI, I need to be able to discover quickly. Now this is where the real magic happens. Search and exporting. So if I look at my export thing here, my export stream, I can also look at contains PHI. I can see maybe when the start date, the effective date is, who authored it, maybe any kind of statistics. But the other portion is, it doesn't stop at SharePoint. I know, right? Awesome. It looks at Exchange, which when it looks at Exchange, it looks at emails, contacts, meetings, tasks, notes, documents, link messages. It basically looks at your environment as a whole. So for example, I'm going to look at my compliance area. Now there's only one document in my whole compliance portion that has PHI tagged on it, which is Bob's insurance plan. Once again, just to make sure that that we stay fair here. Here's my insurance plan, and this is the only one in here that contains PHI. Just to clarify again, I'm going to go ahead and hit contains PHI. Now the one that I just uploaded earlier has to be identified because I haven't searched again, but that is the only one that's there. Okay, Jason, that's fine. What happens to it? What does that mean? What do I do with this? Well, I can then export this, and then what I can do is download the results. And what happens is I get a little screen over here that's going to download it. It's going to just take 1 second. And what's going to give me is going to give me a full report that I can give to maybe outside organization, outside counsel, and still saving. Just give me one quick sec, and I'll open it up for you. And it doesn't provide just like basic stuff, but it shows me all the audit trail behind it as well. So here's the folder that I just got. I'm going to bring it over here. Now then I can provide this folder to anybody. So if I look at reports, I can see all the SharePoint results, which show me what the title is, what the file name is, what it is, who authored it, where the URL is, who created it by, what size, what source, where it come from. But it doesn't stop there. I can also look at the whole summary. I can see the case information, how many items that were identified to it, who downloaded it, the statistics, all of the different sources, if it contains PHI. Once again, you can then basically provide one single package to your whole compliance officers. Now, Jason, what does that mean? Does that mean that I still got to give them access to SharePoint? No, because what it does is it exports the documents with it. So in the file structure, this is my portal, the SharePoint set that I have. Here's my portal again. Here's my library, and there's my document. So not only are you providing them with the information that you found within your SharePoint environments, as well as your Exchange environment, as well as your Link environment, but you're also providing them the straight-up files for it. So that provides a whole lot of functionality for your records management. It really cuts down on that risk and that risk to not comply with those compliance areas that you may be looking to happen to do. Now, your records managers can go in here and actually create these e-discovery or create these cases very easily. Creating a new case here is just a matter of calling it maybe PII, for example. And basically, that just created a new case for me, which has a whole new discovery set, whole new query, all new in-place records. Just to show you how easy this is, let's go ahead and say, I'm going to go ahead and show you how easy it is to find PII. So I'm going to go ahead and say contains PII, right, and hit search. I'm going to make a I'm going to put my URL in here. I can see all the documents that are associated with PII. So I have Bob's insurance plan, resume, payroll. Very quickly, see how fast that was? I can see what's a document, what's not a document. Once again, quickly define this, and then I can export this out, save it for later use, do additional search querying and additional items. Once again, making sure that the records managers and the records centers have all the information they need to if anything would pop up. Now, the other portion of it, just the last thing I'm going to cover before we open up for question is, what does it look like when I run reports? What does this auditing look like? So, for example, I've already run some audit reports. So one is I looked at content viewing. So I want to see how many people looked at a document. So I open up this content viewing. I can see that this training document, that I sent over to the other place was viewed twice for a grand total of 2 times. And then I can also look at the data. I can see who did it, where they did it at, the location, when it occurred, what happened, scrolling over, if any custom events happened, what source, if it was SharePoint, Exchange, what version, remember how I said a version is very important, what version they looked at. So for example, if employee X said, hey, I looked at that policy on October, but it was really changed in December, you can see what version they viewed and when they viewed it. Once again, the client area is super great. The next portion is the file plan. So once you set your file plan up or you don't know what the file plan that you're looking for and you want to see what content's being done, your file plan in SharePoint will look like this. I can see that the insurance plans are being added, the policy name that's being attached with it, if versioning's happening, how many items that are out there, where it's coming from, who can read it, the disposition, records, if there's records, if it has records, if there are any items on hold. So once again, a great way to make sure that everything is available for your records managers from nuts to bolts, as well as folder details and retention details that are already there. So you can see all my retention policies are right there ready to go. Once again, quick and easy to provide to your records managers for compliance areas. Now, we are running close to time, so I want to open up for questioning for the last 5 minutes. So please feel free to ask your question to the discussion panel, as well as I'm going to go ahead and put this PowerPoint back up here. If you come up with questions later on today or in the future, here's our contact info. Please reach out. As you can probably hear, we're super excited and we're super excited about SharePoint and records management, SharePoint, contracts management, SharePoint. Basically, anything that's revolving around SharePoint, we have a lot of passion about, and we're glad to talk about it and basically help you guys out with however you need to be. So one of the questions were, how can you approve documents using SharePoint? So just like we did with that that workflow where I was able to delete it or move it to another location, you can also have that as approvals. So the workflows in SharePoint don't just stop at disposition, but you can also have a multi-stage approval process. So let's think of a 3-stage approval where it goes from maybe a pending or a draft to pending to final. SharePoint workflows, as well as the third-party workflows that we deal with, can facilitate the fact that you can actually go through maybe 4 or 5 approval processes before it becomes a final product, and that final product can be a record. Another question is, they have a lot of WAV files that are medical records. Basically, how do you handle there? So SharePoint can scale, which is great. So you have the ability to scale up to hundreds of terabytes of data within SharePoint and having a searching capability and managing those records. One of the best things I can say from a good point to handle those is identify what medical records are there. Find out maybe if they're contain PHI or PHII, or if there's compliance areas that you need to keep them for, or how long. Create that record plan, and then basically move them into SharePoint. It might be a little bit of a bumpy road up first, just to make sure that we can identify those records, or use one of the third-party products I was telling you about to automatically detect what they are. But at that point, as soon as they get to SharePoint, then you can manage those records effectively. It doesn't make a difference if it's thousands of WAV files or if it's billions of WAV files. Once they're in SharePoint, then we can manage those effectively. Can we handle two-way cross-record references? You are absolutely right. Great question. Being able to basically help with the parent-to-child relationship, where it's a many-to-many or a one-to-many or a many-to-many. Essentially, SharePoint can do the same manner, doing links. So behind the scenes by SharePoint, everything is ran what's called document IDs or GUIDs or something along those lines, where you can actually make those connections up. The next question is basically the next person in an approval chain. Can they be notified, or is there something? What happens? So actually, the SharePoint in workflow, you can send them emails, you can send them task notifications, you can send them alerts, you can send them link messages. The possibilities to make sure that they're alerted are endless. And actually, what's really cool is some of the third-party products out there will allow them to receive an email and say, hey, do you approve this? And they can respond to an email right away and say, hey, I approve this document, and send the email back to SharePoint, and SharePoint can pick it up and automatically approve that document without ever touching SharePoint. Now, that's not native SharePoint, it is a third-party product, but that is just some of the capabilities that are out there. Typically, a lot of your approval processes in SharePoint are really handled and really driven by task-based things. So I'm asking a user, what should I do with this? And they come in here and say they approve it or reject it or do something else with it. But they're notified via email or link message or one of those very common notifications. Yeah, we don't send text message. I mean, we can send text messaging, but we don't send beeper or pagers. Anybody that has pagers out there, move to text messaging from this device.
Great. It looks like we're right at the time frame anyway, and I don't think we have any more questions. Jason, did you just pop back the screen to me for a second?
Sure can.